Welcome to Unscripted with IMF.
This is the podcast that covers leadership, relevant hot topics, encouragement, stories, and the future of the church.
This is a space for ministry leaders to learn how to ignite change and inspire growth wherever you serve, because IMF exists to serve those who serve others.
Now let's get into today's episode of Unscripted with IMF.
All right, hey friends, Pastor John here, and I'm with Erica.
Hi guys, so glad to join you here. I'm Erica, the marketing director here at International Ministerial Fellowship.
And we have with us my friend Larry Osborne, and you have probably heard of his name, and if not, you should. Larry, it's great to have you with us today.
Thank you. Good to be with you too, John.
I just want to let you know that it's an honor to have Larry on the show with us today because Larry personally invested in me. I was part of the Next Generation Leaders Group with Dave Travis Leadership Network, probably, I think it was about 10, 12 years ago now. And as I sat under Larry and you mentored me and have still through your books, but has made a huge impact on my pastoral ministry. I mean, we are a better church, Larry, in part because you chose to impart your wisdom on us younger leaders, and now I'm not that young anymore.
Well, think what that means for me.
Well, you were always young, so but it made a huge impact on our church, and we've grown. And I still remember, Larry, you said this. You said, "I want," and this is probably 10 years ago. You said, "I want to spend the next season of my ministry investing in pastors and leaders." And I still remember that. And it has been really cool to see you invest in all these leaders for all these years and thousands of pastors' lives to make an impact in the church for the glory of God.
Well,
so
thanks. Been fun.
That's my introduction. I know it was a little bit longer, but it's great to have you with us, Larry. And so tell us what's going on right now in your ministry world.
Well, I am no longer, after 40 plus years being the lead pastor at North Coast, I'm not in that role. I'm what's called a kingdom ambassador and teaching pastor. Teach about 18 times a year. We've always had a teaching team there. Right. So even in the lead role, especially with Chris Brown, who's now the lead pastor, such a gifted communicator, probably the last 10, 15 years, you'd teach 23, 24 times, maybe each of us, and then a few others. So I'm doing about 18 of those. I'm really not involved in the day-to-day stuff, so that Chris is freed up to be the leader without a shadow around. And I spend the rest of my time working with pastors in all kinds of different events, from speaking at conferences, groups that come out. And then I have a fairly large contingent of large church pastors that I'm in a kind of coaching, mentoring relationship with. And I do about 10 Eagles Nest a year, which is by invite only, again, larger churches, either XP and mostly lead pastors, kind of 9 at a time, bring them out to California, rent a big beach house. And what do you want to talk about for 2 or 3 days? So all in all, I'm incredibly busy, but I'm not in the day-to-day of the North Coast stuff. So I get to be in the day-to-day of all the other churches I work with.
I think that's a great position to be in. And you led well at North Coast for a long time. And Chris is a good communicator. You're an excellent communicator. So it's really cool to see. I have a couple of questions for you. One is this just kind of getting into the meat of what we're going to talk about. And I don't have a script saying, here's my 20 questions. I know your style is more organic as we talk about things and they come up. But what post-COVID trends do you see that are sticking?
Well, a lot of people who, didn't like video or online or whatever have come to realize, yes, it really works. And I think one of the things a significant number of people, not all, but a significant number of people still don't get is that discipleship at its core is made up of two things. It's made up of information and relationships. Those are the two ingredients. But we've often thought that it's not relationships, it's acquaintance. So post-COVID, I still see a lot of people trying to drive people back into the building where, hey, how you doing? Fine, which basically means none of your business, but that's okay. I didn't really care anyway. I just wanted you to know I saw you. And so I find a lot of pastors and leaders kind of want to get everybody back in the building and not realizing now until mobility came along, churches were small. Relationships are absolutely essential. That's one reason at North Coast we were built around a whole small group model being the core of our ministry, not the weekend. Still, obviously, having a zillion people show up on the weekends. But I think that might be the biggest thing. I often use myself as an example, and my best friend. My best friend has not been back to North Coast more than twice since COVID. But he and his wife are very involved in a life group. They serve, they give, they make a difference. They just don't take up a seat. And I myself get way more out of a message when I can time shift it 5 minutes forward, an hour later, whatever it would be. And I'm not looking in the room wondering why that gal's giving that guy a back rub, and what's going on here, and all the things you notice in a room. My wife and I, we can stop it, or if you're with a small group, you can discuss it. So to me, that's probably the biggest thing that people still don't realize is genuine discipleship can take place on a screen, as long as you're backing it up with genuine relationships that are not the how you doing fine acquaintances, but the places where you're really known and you can't hide. And for that reason, a lot of churches have found themselves with greater engagement, even greater income, and yet less attendance. And they're scratching their head trying to figure out why. And I go, well, there's a lot of people who decided I actually get more out of the content when I'm watching it on a screen with a small group of people or even alone. So that's one of the big ones to me.
Yeah.
Also, the culture shift. The culture is way more angry
Yes.
than it was, and people need to realize, and it's not changing. Quickly, part of the reason is echo chambers have created it, and we always lived in echo chambers, but they were geographic. So you move from the deep south to the northeast, you didn't have much likelihood of having success, or vice versa. And each region kind of thought the other regions were either stupid or immoral for the way they were different. But now our echo chambers are by choice. We choose the world we want to live in. And so the people who hate echo chambers the most are not willing to give up choice. So they're going to continue. And they've created a very angry culture where everybody doesn't understand different viewpoints.
I think some of us need you to unpack. When you say echo chamber, what are you referring to?
Well, an echo chamber is when you just live with other people who think just like you. So again, they were regional in the past. There was a Southern way of looking at, and there's exceptions.
Right.
And then we were pretty monolithic in the United States and much of the Western world due to media for a while. And then along came the ability now for everything to be niched. And so people live in a little theological niche world, a news niche world, a political niche world. And the assumption is if you don't see the world like I do, you must either be stupid on both sides, or there's something morally wrong with you on both sides. And what we're experiencing is the end of Romans chapter 1. You have the downward cycle of a culture that ignores God. And most people think it's sexual decadence at the bottom, but that's next to the bottom. We hit that in the 60s. Sexually transmitted diseases slowed that down. We picked it up again. But when he says, therefore he gave them over to a depraved mind to do what ought not be done, all kinds of wickedness, every item after that is relational destruction. And in much of the European world and the United States, Canada in particular, we're living in that world of no faithfulness, no forgiveness, no mercy, gossip, slander, being called information and transparency. So that's a huge one. I think COVID accelerated that, especially with the different viewpoints of how to deal with it. And I'm always telling pastors I work with, small church plant to massive, massive church. you'd better understand that going forward. It's not going to change unless there's some revival or God steps in. You're going to walk on eggshells more than ever.
So how, as I pastor now, I would certainly concur with you that we're dealing with a lot more angry people and divided people. So what would you say to us, other pastors like you and I here who are dealing in these situations where basically they have groups in their church that are angry? How do you minister in this context?
Yeah. Well, you've always had people who push back on truth, push back on preferences, all of that. It's just magnified right now. But I think the biggest difference, I started talking about echo chambers and their impact maybe 12 years ago. And I get some looks like, what are you talking about? But mostly from, say, 45 and younger, I'd get, well, you're just being a wimp. You're afraid to challenge things. And since post-COVID, all those same people are now saying, will you give that Switzerland talk again? But in a nutshell, it's this. When something is a hot button issue, a lot of us, because we're verbally skilled, think that we can, in a monologue to a large group, communicate, which is very different than one-on-one dialogue or a small group. And so we stand up and we say things trying to solve the problem. But what we don't realize, when any issue is a hot button issue, people are not listening to see what the Bible says. They're listening to see what side you're on. Zero listening to. In fact, I've asked over 5,000 pastors, literally, have you ever talked to a hot button issue and had somebody come up after the service and say, thank you, Pastor, you changed my mind. I've never had a hand go up. And it's always been that way. But again, in this culture, there's more of them. So I think one of the big shifts is we have to do what Proverbs talks about and figure out what is the right time to say truth, not just, well, I said truth. For instance, if I get on an airplane, which I do fairly often, I'm sitting next to somebody. Truth is, you need to know Jesus, or you're going to spend an eternity away from him. But I don't say, hi, I'm Larry. Are you a Christian? Or you want to know how to get saved, right? You look at me like, what kind of jerk for Jesus are you? Right. Well, leaders need to understand in the monologue communication, written or spoken, it's the same thing. That you have to be asking the question of, are people open and what's being heard? But a lot of pastors have got up and they played prophet, and then they're all upset because they got the prophet's reward. It's like, dude, if you're going to be Jeremiah, expect what Jeremiah got.
Right. So that's that's some great insight. And you touched on a little bit, like people watching on screens nowadays. We've always heard about the small church, the micro church, big churches trying to be small, and it seems now, just in my understanding, there's a movement again, and it seems like it just cycles on micro churches or home churches. The words change.
It's like a Hallmark movie. I've seen them so many times. I can hear 5 minutes of it and I know how it's going to end. There has, and Ed, I'm not just the only one. Ed Stetzer's done some research on this as well. There is no movement towards a micro church. There has always been some micro church movement, and it always gets presented in books and conferences as if it's the next big thing. And yet there's no hard data to prove that anywhere. It does show up in some areas and countries where Christianity is either illegal or foreign religion. And it has always done that. But other than that, there are movements of it, and it's a both and world. I'm the biggest fan ever of house churches. I love them. Yeah. But to say it's house church versus mega church is to basically use conversations and situations we've seen and then turn that into research.
Right. I like how you say both and, not either or. And it seems like a lot of people have said it's either or. You're either part of a small church or you're part of a big church.
Yeah, so it's kind of like coffee. People go, "Oh man, Starbucks. I hate Starbucks." Well, and they like their little mom and pop roaster, because they're a coffee aficionado. Great. there's a lot of people out here in Oceanside, where I live, is kind of a mecca of that kind of stuff, almost like Seattle was back. And all kinds of people go there, but guess what? There's still a long line at Starbucks as well, and somebody can say, oh, I hate that mom and pop, or I hate Starbucks. Great. But they're both selling a lot of coffee.
Yeah, I agree. I asked a pastor of a small church, well, microchurch, he calls it a home church. I said, what's your end? Meaning like, okay, you're a home church, so what's your end? Well, most people who pastored say, well, we're trying to grow the church, and eventually we'll end up renting a place. Like, okay, so you're just starting a church. Your end goal isn't to be 15 people forever.
Right.
It's just kind of
It is. We got to keep spinning off a lot. And of course, that's where the movement, when you get the people who write and speak on it, that's what they're talking about. But again, it's amazing how few have hard numbers in research. Well, it's so organic, it's hard to keep track of. I go, well, that's a great excuse. And again, I've heard it every decade. So I'm on my 5th run of it right now.
Well, I'm glad I'm not the only one who's asking those questions. It's not that we don't like it. I would agree that.
Now, I will agree with this. You don't have discipleship when you have content and acquaintance. So the big thing we're missing in the modern church, but it's not the mega church. Any church at 200-300 hits it. Where, in fact, I tell people, they go, well, we're just 100. We're really tight. I go, do you drive to the meeting? Yes. If you drive the meeting, you have time to put on the facade. For most of history, there was no mobility and therefore no opportunity to put on the facade and hide. And for me, that's why I tell churches you need to have a small group ministry, because the missing ingredient today is a place where I can't hide, not where I'm being forced to be an emotional exhibitionist, but just where I can't hide because I'm around people too much. And we desperately do need that, but that's not anti-big church. That's even 200 or 300 is already too big.
Yeah. Yeah. So you said we have content and acquaintance, and then you've been pushing in on the relationship piece. And I know I'm sure you've thought this out in your words. So it's relationship and what?
Well, relationship is basically friendship or acquaintance to the level of I can't hide.
Right.
So as an example, and this is our description, not a prescription for others, but at the North Coast model of small groups, we don't divide and multiply. Hey, you need friendships. Now you have them. If you love Jesus, divide and multiply so I can grow the church bigger. It's not a front door. It's a back door closer, because the one thing that's missing is 15, 20-year relationships.
Mm-hmm.
So I would always try to tell a small group leader, it's really okay if you guys talk about somebody's vacation for 30 minutes, do one of the questions, as long as you share and pray together at the end. This is not a content scantron discipleship model, but everybody wants to, do information, get through the questions and all that. And I go, no, what's lacking is people, when you say I'm fine, somebody who can say, no, you're not.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. We adopted, basically, if you shared it, I ripped it off at some point in my career. I know I did. But when it comes to the small group piece, and you said, I remember that years ago, you're like, why do you want to tell your small groups to divide? You spend all this time building relationships, and now you ask them to part ways. And typically people don't get into another small group because they don't want to go through the pain of a broken relationship. So,
or they do it one time, but not multiple times. And
Yeah.
the problem there is gift projection. Leaders who are willing to do all things to reach people, all things to all people, that I might reach some. Paul is defending his ministry, explaining his thought pattern, not giving a command for everybody. And leaders tend to gift project leadership on people who are followers, not leaders.
Wow.
And, as a leader, man, I'm changing all the time.
Right.
But not everybody's called to be a leader, contrary to what most leaders think.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So if, a lot of the people who are listening right now, they're newer in ministry. Now, when I say newer, what we're finding is that not a lot of people are going through traditional seminaries and pastoring in church when they're 24 years old. They're coming in later in life, maybe in their 30s or 40s. But for someone who's going into ministry, they're listening to this, several hundred people that are going into ministry right now. What would you say these are some skills, if you're going to pay attention to anything in ministry, these are some vital skills that you just have to nail down?
Well, there's both character and then skill. So in the skill realm, I think people need to realize your job is to disciple people, which is to give them instruction in Christian living with the Bible as your only authority. But that's very different than your job is to be a Bible teacher. So you're happy when people walk out with the outline of Colossians. Now, Colossians was written, all scripture is given for instruction, training, correction, right? That's all of it. And so I think a lot of people have if I'm theologically correct and walked you through the passage and match up some things I got in a commentary, I've done a good job. And I'm always saying, well, what would you do if you were meeting in a coffee shop? Right? I mean, the book of James, you could put the lens on How to Survive Junior High. You could put the lens on, believe it or not, when I do a preaching seminar, I have people put together a series from James on marriage. Like what? Because we've got all these other passages. We think of Ephesians, Genesis, but you put the lens on it. Wow, count it all joy when you fall into various troubles. Be quick to hear, slow to speak. Don't blame other people. I mean, it goes on and on. So the Bible is written to reveal God, our hearts, but also to instruct us. And so I would tell the biggest skill I see lacking in church planters is they don't understand what they're trying to do with people. And that's helped them take the next step of obedience, not turn them all into hyper dogs, leaders, So, and then personally, I would think is, I always tell people, if you're starting a vocational ministry role, you should build the ministry you'd want to go to, not the one you think will get big.
Yeah.
Because the one you want to go to is the only one you're gifted to do. You don't need a manual to figure out, and you'll enjoy. But everybody instead goes and sees who has the most people.
Right.
It's just like preaching. I tell people, when you're learning to preach, don't listen to the person who has the biggest crowd. Listen to the person who speaks to your heart. And whether that's big or small, that'll help you bring out your message, not a poor version of someone else. And relax. Again, we've got all these myths out there when it comes to starting a vocational ministry that we're supposed to change the world and everything. And, we read the Bible. Let me give you an example. We read the Bible, and if you're a leader, you're always Moses in the story, dealing with the riffraff. And it's like, no, there's like one Moses. You and I are the riffraff. But we always make ourselves a hero of the story. How did Jesus deal with these people? No, I'm the whore. I'm not Jesus. And there's a lot of relaxing that comes with that. It's my job's to salt the oats, lead the horse to water, and see what the Holy Spirit does. I think there's way too much credit we give ourselves when it blows up good and blame when it blows up bad.
Yeah, when Peter walked on the water, all the other disciples stayed in the boat. They could have all gone, and we'd probably be the people in the boat going, what are you doing?
Yeah. And like I said, you're just called to be a prophet to your own generation and your own world. And somehow this vocational ministry thing has turned into a career, and we're trying to climb a career path. And I go, that'll poison your soul. Yes, I have pastored, a massive giga church. But the thing is, I was never driven to pastor a massive giga church. It's just like, oh, they came, we'll take care of them. Yeah. So I want to figure out how to remove roadblocks and light rockets, but I don't want to take ministry steroids. Just like physically, you can take steroids to get bigger, they'll kill you. And you take ministry steroids to get your church bigger, it will kill it.
Yeah, that's a good word there, especially for people who are aspiring to pastor churches, because we all compare ourselves to,
Mhm.
who's on TV, who's on TikTok, and everyone's watching Stephen Furtick going, why isn't my church 50,000 people? It's like, well, God only made one Stephen Furtick, one Larry Osborne, this just shepherd the people that you're around.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
changing gears a little bit, one of the things that I've been telling pastors, especially in areas, I'm like, learn how to pastor your community. Don't just pastor your church, but consider your congregation to be the entire community, not just the people who show up at your door. So pastor your community. What would you say concerning that? What are ways that we can pastor our communities?
Well, if you have kids, that's one of the best seasons of all of life. When our kids were younger, we were part of sports leagues and stuff like that. And I mean, that would be an example. We used to have before video came along and we were able to do our video venues and sites and all that. We used to have 2 Saturday night services plus a Sunday. And I'll tell you, some of my sermons were pretty lame on Saturday night because I was out with my kids coaching their little league team, trying to get the right fielder to quit chasing butterflies. And the Sunday centric way of looking at ministry says, oh no, I should have ignored my kids and not been out in the community. And no, my job was to, first of all, number one congregation is my wife and my kids. And the second thing, I'm called to be connected to community. And once in a while, that'll mean the sermon on Saturday wasn't quite as good as the one on Sunday. It's like, okay. I tell pastors, your job is to do the best you can under the circumstances, not the best you can, because none of us will ever do the best we could. There's always more. And like, no, do your best under the circumstances and take a nap. It's really okay. You're just a cog in the wheel. We're a mist here today, gone tomorrow. And that's not discouraging to me. It's incredibly freeing to me.
Right. So yeah, so you would say it is important to pastor your community through kids events, pastor your own family.
I have a pastor friend who has everybody on their staff, since we're talking about people in vocational ministry, every one of them is supposed to have a side hustle. Like, what? Well, the reason he has everybody on his staff have a side hustle so they understand the real world.
Right.
Yeah.
And they're also forced to be out there mixing with people, whatever that little side hustle is. Drive Uber, do this, do that. You've got to have something that you're doing besides quote full-time. In fact, for a lot of church planners, that's a problem. They dream of the day they'll be full-time. And the day you're full-time is the day you start to get swallowed up by the organization. And you start, I don't know, you become a professional Christian, whatever that is.
For years in Minnesota, I started and ran a snowplow and lawn business. And I tell you what, and I just sold it about 10 years ago, but that kept me humble. I mean, I'd plow these townhomes. I'd have people yelling at me and hollering at me and telling me what I was a lousy person and flipping me off. And in the winter, people get really crabby in Minnesota whenever it snows. I'm just telling you.
They do.
But that, it reminded me like, okay, these are the people I'm serving. And the funny thing is, sometimes I would see them at church, but they'd have no idea that I was the guy that they just cussed out there.
How funny.
Shoveling their sidewalk, and it was good. It was humbling, but I learned a lot.
And again, just to know what the world's like, and in most jobs, maybe that job was such an emergency help, it didn't happen. But in most side hustles, you're actually out there dealing with people, and it's the people who understand that end up seeing those people come to Jesus.
Right. Yeah, because they can have conversations about business and what's going on, and reading the New York Times or Wall Street Journal, and just having not just talking about the Apostle Paul with your neighbors, but talking about real world events and what's happening.
Right. See, I've been in vocational ministry since I was 20, and all my degrees, all 3 of them, are in that. So I have worked really hard to get outside side hustles. You mentioned reading those things, because If I talk about God shows up just when we need him, and I use manna as my only illustration, it's nowhere near as powerful as if I'm able to say, it's like just-in-time delivery systems in the business world. And Deming came up with this, and they'll stand up and they'll go, because most people think all a pastor knows is family, sports, and Bible. And I'm suddenly, especially with men, able to get into their lives when they understand. I actually know the importance of speed of inventory turn. I've got some understanding of economics, the marketplace, and all of that. It just, I thought, whoa, they listen at a whole different level.
Did you know that IMF offers the ability for you to complete continuing professional education credits? Well, we do. In partnership with the Institute for Clinical Pastoral Training, we are an approved CPE provider. For more information or to enroll for CPE units, visit imfserves.org/CPE Center. That's imfserves.org/CPE Center.
So, churches have done a great job historically of reaching white collar workers because we have church on Sunday mornings. But a large part of our world is blue collar shift working people. What advice would you have for someone who's like trying to reach their community and thinking differently other than just having a Sunday morning service?
Well, it depends on what community you're in. So in a mostly Anglo community, there is a tendency to reach white collar. And frankly, it's mostly middle management white collar. We don't understand how to reach top level leaders. And as you said, the blue collar, I think the biggest thing is you go to where they are. That's exactly why we had a Saturday night service. And in our structure, everything was online as soon as possible. In the old days, you could get cassettes. We made our life groups sermon-based lecture lab model. So that meant if you were a shift worker, you could still get that information and then still be in a small group all throughout the week. I basically tell people that if you develop in a ministry, this is not true of your leaders and people, but the core people in a community will give you 2 time slots. You better figure what you want to do with those 2 time slots. And for us, is we wanted you in a small group and learning. And at that point, nothing was online, so it's a worship service. And so the more that I can get it so it's available to you at another time, the better. That's one reason I'm a huge fan of Thursday nights. I've been pushing those for probably 12, 13 years, and more people are adding a Thursday night service. I think it's the new Saturday night. Because Saturday still, again, we added a Sunday night too, not a different service. So it was pretty hard to have a schedule. You couldn't make it to one of our things. Which, by the way, you mentioned earlier before we're getting ready, you guys are in a building process. I'm a big fan when I talk to church planners. I go, you want to get to 4 services as soon as possible. They look at me like, what? And I go, I'd never want to ever build anything to get everybody back in one. That the more services you have to have. So that helped us. We were all over the place. Pre-COVID, we had 156 different service times locally. If you counted a location, a time, or a style. And so it was pretty hard to go, I can't find one.
Right. Yeah, I did read that oftentimes churches go, oh, we want to build a giant sanctuary so we can go back to one service. And all it does is it makes it easier on the staff.
Totally. It's
Right.
not reaching people. Yep.
But they, churches do that. We're actually building less square footage than both of our campuses if you combine them. We're building a smaller so that we will still have multiple services. And now we have 4 different venues or 4 different times. And yeah, I agree. And what I found this out is that pastors build a big sanctuary expecting more people to come, and there's a dip. They actually have less people coming because they don't offer as many service times.
Yeah, we watched the church. Oh, this is 30 years ago now. That was a going and blowing place in our community when we were I don't know, 6, 7, 800. And I pulled the staff together when they were building their new building, because they used to have 6 services. And they built a big building to have one. And I said, this will be the first church you ever saw spend millions of dollars to build a beautiful place, and it's going to shrink. And sure enough, it shrunk. And now it's just a dead, empty church, because everything was done for the convenience of the staff, not for the hearts and souls of the people.
Right.
So how do you encourage the staff? Like, it's not about making your life easier by having less
Well,
services.
you got to take care of this. See, one of the things I think lead pastors do is they forget, because the lead pastor is usually paid more, has certain privileges, margin, all that kind of stuff. So they can forget, or they can make people go, well, I did all these sacrifices, you have to. So the illustration I use is this, John. If I owned the Pony Express back in the day, the ponies and the mail would both be important, but the ponies are more important than the mail. And so when I'm talking to the pastor and the staff, I've got 2 different messages. To the pastor, I'm saying your ponies are more important than the mail, which means the people who serve are more important than the people they serve. Because I could screw up the mail once in a while and still have a Pony Express. I kill my ponies, I'm dead. So it's the role of the leader to protect the ponies. And what the ponies need to know is you're not going to run hard forever. I call it the playoffs, to mix metaphors. You play hurt in the playoffs because you might not get there again. But when the regular playoffs become the regular season, something's wrong. And so for us, we had all these services, and everybody's all hands on deck when you're kicking it off and all that. And then when it begins to go, we need to say, like, well, who can we hire appropriately, for that size? You can't duplicate the mothership everywhere, but for that size, where do we get the part-time help, the whatever it would be? It's not just everybody run harder. You run harder in crisis and massive opportunity, and then you've got to go back to pace. So my experience with staff was always, when they knew this wasn't forever, they were willing to do it, but they'd push back and not want to add anything new when they felt like, well, for the next 6 months, I'm going to be a bad dad, a bad mom, a bad parent, spouse, whatever. And it's like, well, no, I shouldn't make you that. Does it make sense, both sides?
Yeah, it does, very much so. Because you can't, in ministry, there's times when you run, times when you walk, times when you rest.
It's a season.
It's a season. And and I hate to say it, but I guess I'll admit it, that when I first started in church, every day was Super Bowl day. Like, everyone's crisis was my emergency. And I modeled it, and I killed myself doing it. And I had to eventually repent and apologize to my team, and let the pressure out of the balloon, so that everyone was able to relax and do their job and not feel like, oh my gosh, the world's falling apart.
So vocational ministry should be hard work. It shouldn't be killing work unless we're called to it. And I think sometimes we have this idea, we've got 2 extremes. One is this idea, don't let the church take advantage of you. Well, try that in the marketplace. It's like, you ought to work at least as hard as the marketplace. Come on, But then the flip side is, well, the Satan never rests, you never rest. And I go, well, that's crazy. And on our staff, families had different needs. There was a high maintenance spouse and a low maintenance spouse. There were kids with special needs. There's a period where you got a lot of young ones needing a lot of time. Then there's more, they're older and out on their own. So I don't think you can expect the same thing from everybody at the same time either.
Yeah.
Right. No, I would totally agree.
That's a leader's got to know the ponies and what their limits are.
Yeah, that's a good word there. So lead pastors, pay attention to your ponies. That's your staff. And if you are a pony, make sure that you're speaking up and sharing where you're at. You can sacrifice yourself for the church, and then people end up quitting ministry. They're totally burned out. And that's not good, because we need more people in ministry, because we have a world that's falling apart. So I want to encourage pastors, stay in, just run at a respectable pace that you can maintain. You just can't sprint forever.
Mhm.
So well, I had a question here about services. So when you encourage churches, to put their services online, do you encourage them to put the entire service on YouTube or just the message?
Well, here we discovered something, and it depends on the church. So at North Coast Church, we're kind of known as a teaching church. We've had a very strong stable of teachers, a teaching team model. So we get lots of people who come to us for content, but maybe their church doesn't have great teaching, or maybe it has great teaching and they're just a Bible junkie. So we're ancillary ad there, and I'm glad we could do it. But when it comes to the people who just come to church, we are their church. Here's what we discovered, and we were shocked by it. The sermon we shoot on Thursday in the studio, and we've done for the last 3 or 4 years, if you go online, is never the best sermon for me or Chris or any of our teachers. It drives me nuts. Nobody's heard me do as well as I do because there's not an audience there. I have one person in a room, so if I say something sarcastic, I can see if they smirk or whatever. But what happens is all the people who once went to North Coast want to see the entire service on stage. Poor production, but it brings them back. 100% of the people who've never been to North Coast prefer the version chest up, talking, looking at the screen the whole time, because it's better production. And what hit me personally was I always wanted the better sermon. Then I realized that's my ego. So here's how it hit me. We used to have the 4 services, and they'd say, which one do you want on the archive? And I'd pick the one I was funniest, or whatever. And they go, well, whatever. But once in a while, I'd have one I thought was best. And they'd say, well, we had a little glitch. And then I'd always go, well, then pick the other one, please. Because production is more important than how good I was. Right? Well, that helped me understand, that's the value of our studio version. So if people have a lot of audience, I think a studio version is better. If it's more their own people, then probably the online is better. And go ahead and put all the worship. But if you don't mix it properly, I wouldn't. Because everybody checks out your service online. And we have some of the worst worship on online places because we don't mix it properly for being used that way. And at that point, I go have a little clip, show the sermon, and get off. But if you can mix it, do the whole thing, and people, they know how to fast forward.
Yeah.
True. Yeah, that's true. Because a lot of pastors do. They just put up only the message. And I think that we're that church too that just does that.
Well, in the archive, people are just going for the message.
Yeah.
So the week of, we will have a worship set, our studio worship set. But once that's done, they're actually just going for the archive.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess we do that too. We do live on YouTube and live on Facebook, and then the archives are just the message. But people can still find the whole thing on those channels. But that's good. So what new trends are you seeing? Like, this is coming down the pipe, and we need to pay attention to this.
Well, again, the whole movement towards realizing most people gather most information on a screen is finally being understood. It's funny, I'll have podcasters who go, I don't think teaching works on a screen. It's like, whatever. It's like, you see the inconsistency in that. We've got a whole for instance, if you get a builder age who are, now late 80s, 90s, they won't have any friend they've never met unless it was a quote pen pal. Boomer probably won't, once in a while will. You move to Gen X, they'll have 1, 2. You move all the way down to Gen Z or young millennials, they'll have multiple people they've never met they consider a friend.
Oh yeah.
They met them in gaming or whatever. So I think that's the biggest cultural shift that hasn't really made its way broadly into the church. For instance, small groups on Zoom can work. They don't work when you've got a local opportunity, but I'm shocked they work. And as far as communication, like we're doing right now, awesome. I do have coaching clients that I actually work with in a regular systematic way. And on screen has changed the whole world as opposed to being on the phone. It's like
Yeah, definitely.
and people not realizing the depth of it. I had a pastor, he's maybe 50, 51, saying, well, I just don't know about on screen. And I said, so-and-so, you realize you consider me one of your best friends. We've talked about a lot of life over the last 5 years. We've only met twice. And once was a conference you came to, I was speaking at, you caught me in the outside plaza and asked if I do any coaching. And the other was a 25-person teaching workshop we did for 2 days. Like, and yet you're sharing your whole life with me because we can see each other.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that is the biggest, and it hasn't been fully grasped yet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's good. Any comments on that, Erica? Because you are.
Yeah. Well, so I think that a couple different topics really intertwine, at least for me, as we go through this, when we talk about like an online church community and everything. And John knows very well that I was a part of online hosting for our church community through COVID. So we had the opportunity to not only live stream the message, but also have the chat function, right? So we have our host there, and then anyone that's watching to chime in. And it's just, what's cool is you form those relationships. And John, you'll have to remind me, there was a gal that lived out of state that would help host. And so even between me hosting and her hosting, we're able to pray for each other over this time. And I hadn't even met her in person yet. And so that's the same way with these other people that are joining in and experiencing the church virtually. So I think there's just so much value in having that available, and seeing the discipleship that can come through that.
Yeah, if we understand discipleship is simply taking the next step of obedience, whatever that is, from a secret disciple like Joseph of Arimathea was, and finally stepped forward after being an absolute louse, to the Apostle Paul writing Bible and saying, I've not yet arrived. Then we start understanding, okay, what's the next piece of content they need to know to take the next step they need to take? And then we don't care how it gets to them. It's funny to me, some of the people who are most anti-digital are people who read a lot of books.
Yeah.
I remember, I don't know if the people here know, but North Coast was a church that did the first video venue that became multisite and all of that. And so back in the early 2000s, we did it in 98. So say 2000, 2001, there were a lot of kind of academic or brains on a stick that were attacking it as being legit. And one of my favorites was there was a journal called Leadership Journal back then, fairly large. And a guy named Brian McLaren wrote a big piece on how it's just not legit church. And he wrote it. I go, he just wrote to 70, 80,000 people, none of whom have seen you, saying that everything has to be physical, face to face. Whatever. So.
Yeah, that is kind of funny.
Yeah. But if I did it on screen, that's bad. But when he wrote the article, it was okay.
Right.
You think about it, it's all just, you're learning by, by what's the word I'm looking for? Visual learning, right? We're visually learning.
Yeah, we've always done that. We've read, we've heard. That's old Christian radio, now podcast.
Right.
Information is information, and people learn differently.
Yeah.
So I hear you saying, and to all of our listeners, this is important. Some of you are thinking of dropping your video. You're thinking of quitting YouTube. You're considering stopping that because now you're like, well, COVID's over. We want to get people back in the building, so we don't want to give them an opportunity to watch it. So we squeeze them to come back to church. I think Larry would clearly say that's not going to work.
No, we never told people come back Now, remember, we're in California, which is crazy land, and we had COVID as bad as anybody, except for maybe New York, but in terms of the way the government and stuff dealt with it. But when it was time, what we said is we're so happy that we can have a live option. Because I didn't want to drive by guilting on those who had settled into watching with their life group.
Yeah.
Right.
Or their family.
Totally. And you know, we're running 75, you know, I think pre-COVID, we were about 13,200 or something were showing up the 2 months before physically in our local here. And now it's about 10, but yet our engagement's super high. And it would have done no good to take those 3,000 people and tell them, sorry, you're a loser. You got to come back.
Yeah.
So
You gotta count them in as your community, and for pastors that include that, you know, include that while you're in your sermon, you know, and make sure that you're looking at them and acknowledging that they're there just like they would be if they were in the room.
absolutely.
Good. Well, Larry, any final comments that you would have for us here as we wrap this up? It's been great talking with you. Again, your wisdom, I am so appreciative of it. And if you do pastor, I encourage you buy any of Larry's books. They're all beneficial. I mean, I really like Sticky Team, Sticky Church, The Unity Factor. I had my whole board read that book. Lead Like a Shepherd. Our staff just went through that. They just finished that book. So very good. Any final comments, Larry?
No, not really. I get asked that a lot. It's like, I said what I got to say.
You already said it all. It's not like you have that one last phrase that we just have to know.
No, I got nothing I'm dying to say.
All right. Again, good. It's been good to have you. And to all of our podcast listeners, thanks for listening. Thanks for listening and watching if you're doing both.
Yes.
But it's been a blessing. May God bless you and your ministry. Stay strong and stay at it.
Thank you for listening today. If you found value in this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with others. Don't miss the next one. We release new episodes every first and third Thursday of the month. We serve those who serve others in Frontline Christian Ministry. So for more information, visit us at imfserves.org.